What if I told you that the British Empire, the greatest naval power in human history, was built not on the courage of its sailors or the superiority of its ships, but on a systematic program of slow-motion starvation? We picture Victorian seamen as hardy adventurers, wind-whipped and salt-sprayed, conquering distant oceans with British discipline and rum-fueled bravery. The paintings show gleaming ships with billowing white sails, officers in spotless uniforms, and crews of robust men hauling ropes with song and purpose. But strip away this romantic veneer, and you'll find a darker truth. The food that sustained the world's most powerful navy was often more dangerous than enemy cannons, more deadly than the worst storms, and more psychologically devastating than months of isolation at sea. The reality is that Victorian sailors didn't dine, they endured. They didn't eat meals, they negotiated with substances that barely qualified as food. The biscuits were alive with insects. The meat had been dead for years, transformed into something resembling mahogany furniture. The water grew thick with life forms that defied identification. Yet these men consumed it all, day after day, because the alternative was death, and because the empire that sent them to sea valued their labor far more than their lives. To understand what Victorian sailors really ate, we must descend below the polished deck planks, past the officers' quarters with their crystal and silver, down into the ship's belly where the air grows thick and the light dims. Here, in the suffocating darkness between the great guns, we'll discover how the most powerful maritime force on Earth sustained itself on a diet that would make modern prisoners riot. As we journey through this forgotten chapter of imperial history, ask yourself, how much rot would you be willing to swallow if the only alternative was the endless, empty horizon? Chapter 1. The Illusion of Naval Glory. Step aboard Miss Britannia at Portsmouth Harbor on a crisp morning in 1855. The smell of fresh paint mingles with tar and new hemp rope. Brass fittings gleam like mirrors under the pale English sun, and the deck planks shine from recent holystoning. Officers stride purposefully in their blue coats with gold braid, barking orders that send sailors scrambling up rigging with practiced efficiency. Everything speaks of order, discipline, and imperial might. This is the face the Royal Navy presents to the world, a fate of perfection that masks the brutal realities festering in the ship's dark interior. But follow one of those sailors as he disappears down a narrow companionway into the vessel's bowels. The light fades quickly, replaced by the dim swaying glow of oil lamps. The air grows heavy and oppressive, thick with the mingled odors of unwashed bodies, damp timber, bilge water, and something else, something organic and putrid that catches in your throat and refuses to leave. This is where the crew lives, in spaces so cramped that hammocks hang mere inches apart, where a man's shoulders touch his neighbor's on both sides as he tries to sleep. Here we meet our first archetype, the ordinary seaman. Call him Jack. 20 years old, pressed into service from a merchant vessel or recruited from a fishing village, with promises of steady wages and adventure. His hands are thick with calluses from hauling rope. His back bears scars from the cat o' nine tails for minor infractions. And his eyes already show the hollow stare of someone who has learned that survival depends on swallowing both his pride and whatever slop lands in his wooden ball. He owns nothing but the clothes on his back and a small sea chest containing a few personal treasures. But most importantly, he depends entirely on the ship's provisions for survival. Provisions that were selected not for their nutritional value or palatability, but for their ability to remain technically edible for months or years without refrigeration. The provisioning of a Royal Navy vessel was a massive bureaucratic undertaking that the Admiralty approached with characteristic British faith in paperwork and regulations. Every ship departing for extended service received standardized rations calculated to sustain the crew for the duration of their voyage. On paper, these rations appear almost generous. Each sailor was entitled to 1 pound of ship's biscuit daily, 1 pound of salt beef or pork, dried peas, oatmeal, sugar, butter, and either a gallon of beer or a half pint of rum. Calculated by weight and calories, this diet seems adequate, even abundant compared to what many working-class people consumed ashore. But these calculations existed only in ledgers filed in Admiralty offices in Whitehall. The reality of what actually reached the sailors' mouths bore little resemblance to these official numbers. Because between the bureaucrat's pen and the sailor's stomach lay a chain of corruption, incompetence, and systematic cost-cutting that transformed theoretical nutrition into actual poison. The process began with government contracts awarded to the lowest bidders, regardless of quality concerns. These contractors operated vast warehouses near major ports where they stored the preserved foods that would sustain the fleet. The preservation methods available in the mid-19th century were primitive and often catastrophically ineffective. Salt, smoke, and drying were the primary techniques, all of which fundamentally altered food's taste, texture, and nutritional value when they worked at all. Consider the foundation of the sailor's diet, ship's biscuit, officially termed hardtack. These were thick, dense crackers made from flour and water, baked repeatedly until completely desiccated. The goal was not palatability but preservation, driving out every trace of moisture that might allow bacterial growth. Fresh from the ovens, hardtack was merely hard. But hardtack was never fresh when it reached sailors' mouths. It sat in contractors' warehouses for months or years, then in ships' holds for additional months, slowly transforming into something more closely resembling building materials than food. The biscuits became homes for weevils, beetles, and other insects that laid eggs in the flour, hatching into larvae that burrowed through the crackers like miners, leaving them riddled with holes and filled with wriggling life. Experienced sailors developed a ritual around eating these infested biscuits, tap them against the table edge, and watch the insects fall out like rain. Some preferred to eat in darkness to avoid seeing what they were consuming. Others joked that the weevils made the biscuits softer and provided extra protein. But this gallows humor barely masked the psychological trauma of knowingly consuming rotting, infested food. The salt meat presented even greater horrors. Beef and pork were preserved by packing in wooden barrels with massive quantities of salt, which theoretically drew out moisture and prevented bacterial growth. The meat used for this purpose was rarely prime quality. Contractors used the cheapest cuts available, often from animals that were old, diseased, or injured. After months or years in salt brine, the meat transformed into something barely recognizable as organic matter. It turned dark brown or black, became hard as seasoned timber, and developed a taste so intensely salty it burned the mouth and throat. Sailors nicknamed it salt horse, and the term carried no affection. But the true horror of this system became apparent only when you understood its timeline. Jack, gnawing on his evening ration of salt beef in 1855, might well be consuming the preserved flesh of an animal slaughtered during the Napoleonic Wars. The meat was older than he was, had outlasted governments and wars, and bore about as much resemblance to fresh beef as a ship's figurehead bore to a living woman. This was not food in any meaningful sense. It was edible archaeology, the mummified remains of livestock transformed into something that could technically sustain human life, while slowly destroying it. The psychological impact of this diet was immediate and profound. Food represents our most basic connection to comfort, home, and the rhythms of civilized life. On land, meals break up the day's labor, offering moments of sensory pleasure and social connection. At sea, meals became reminders of imprisonment and degradation. There was no variation, no choice, no escape from the monotonous cycle of barely edible provisions. Monday brought salt pork and peas. Tuesday brought salt beef and duff. The pattern repeated with maddening predictability, turning the calendar into an endless loop of salty gray monotony that ground down the spirit as surely as it poisoned the body. Yet this elaborate system of official provisions was only the beginning of the story. What happened when these theoretical rations met the practical realities of shipboard life. Who controlled their distribution? And how did the ship's hidden hierarchy determine who ate well and who slowly starved? The answers lay deeper in the ship's bowels, in the galley where one man wielded the power of life and death through his control of the cooking fires. Chapter 2. The Machinery of Survival. The ship's bell clangs at 4 bells in the morning watch, cutting through the darkness in the symphony of snores, coughs, and groans from hundreds of men packed into the lower decks. Jack opens his eyes to blackness, so complete he cannot see his own hand. Around him, hammocks sway with the ship's motion as other sailors begin stirring. Someone curses in the darkness. Another man coughs, a wet, rattling sound that speaks of lungs damaged by damp air and chronic malnutrition. This is how every day begins, in darkness, discomfort, and the certain knowledge that breakfast will offer no relief from the previous day's misery. Now we encounter our second archetype, the ship's cook, a figure both powerful and pitied in the complex ecosystem of naval life. Often the cook was a sailor who had been injured and could no longer perform regular duties, missing fingers from rope accidents, a wooden leg from cannon mishaps, or other disabilities that made him unsuitable for climbing rigging or hauling artillery. His domain was the galley, a cramped, smoke-filled space dominated by large iron stoves called coppers, which burned coal and provided the only source of heat for cooking on the entire vessel. The cook wielded enormous power because he controlled food distribution, but he was also the target of every complaint about meal quality, despite having no control over the ingredients delivered to his galley. Watch him begin his daily struggle with the impossible. He descends into the hold, lantern in hand, to retrieve provisions from the stored barrels. The hold occupies the ship's lowest, dampest level, located below the waterline where the hull's curve meets the keel. Water constantly seeps through the planking, creating a foul-smelling mixture in the bilge that sloshes with every wave. The barrels of salt meat sit partially submerged in this filth, their wood swollen and slimy to the touch. The cook selects a barrel, pries off the lid with a crowbar, and the smell that escapes defies description. Not just salt, but something organic and fundamentally wrong. Like meat that has begun decomposing despite the preservative. His hand emerges holding a chunk of what was once beef, now transformed into a blackened, rock-hard mass, covered in white salt crystals. He needs both hands and considerable strength to break it free from the other pieces packed tightly together. This grotesque substance is what the crew will eat today, yesterday, and tomorrow, until the barrel empties and another reveals contents equally unappetizing. The cook carries his load to the galley, where he begins the process of making it technically edible. The first step involves soaking. The meat must sit in fresh water for hours to draw out some of the salt, otherwise it would be literally inedible. The sodium content so high it would cause immediate vomiting. But fresh water is precious aboard ship, carefully rationed and monitored. The water used for soaking cannot be wasted, so it gets reused day after day, becoming a thick, salty brine that itself begins to spoil and ferment. The cook tosses the meat chunks into large copper kettles filled with this dubious liquid and sets it to boil over coal fires that fill the galley with choking smoke. While the meat boils, he turns to preparing the other components of the morning meal. He retrieves sacks of ship's biscuit from storage, and here we witness one of the most notorious aspects of the sailor's diet. The biscuits are alive, not metaphorically, but literally crawling with weevils, beetles, and their larvae. When the cook dumps a quantity onto his work surface, they immediately begin moving, as insects disturbed by the light attempt to burrow deeper into the crackers. Some sailors claimed you could hear the biscuits moving at night, a faint rustling sound of thousands of tiny mandibles chewing through flour. The hygiene in the galley would horrify modern health inspectors. Fresh water was too precious for cleaning pots, so the coppers were scrubbed with sand and seawater, or often simply wiped with greasy rags. The fat that rendered from boiling salt pork was called slush, a foul, salty grease that became a currency of its own. The cook had the right to scrape this slush from the pots and sell it back to provisioners when the ship docked, who would then sell it to pastry chefs on land for making pie crusts. This system incentivized the cook never to skim fat from the crew's soup, leaving their meals swimming in layers of translucent, briny oil that coated the mouth and throat. But the cook was not the only figure controlling the crew's sustenance. Behind him lurked our third archetype, the purser, the ship's accountant and quartermaster who managed stores and supplies. In theory, the purser served as guardian of fairness, carefully tracking rations to ensure no man starved. In practice, he operated in a gray world of temptation and opportunity, where every transaction offered chances for profit through creative accounting. Provisions for the ship were purchased in bulk from contractors on land, far from the men who would eventually consume them. Every stage of this supply chain offered someone an opportunity to increase profits by decreasing quality. A contractor might supply cheaper older meat while billing for prime cuts. A dock official might sign off on deliveries without proper inspection in exchange for a small consideration. A purser might stretch stores further than regulations allowed, selling surplus in port for personal profit, or ordering lower-grade provisions while pocketing the difference. The sailors understood this system's corruption intimately. In the dim light of the mess deck, hunched over bowls of thin pea soup, they would mutter about the purser's creative mathematics. "This beef isn't from the Admiralty stores," one might whisper. "This is Knacker's yard scraps." Another would joke that the purser must be dining on real cow, while they chewed on something that had only heard rumors about mooing. But beneath the humor lay genuine fear. If the purser miscalculated or cheated too extensively, if supplies spoiled beyond even these low standards, the men would pay with their bellies and eventually their lives. At 8 in the morning, the crew assembled for breakfast in a ritual that combined military discipline with barely controlled desperation. The men formed into their messes, groups of 6 to 8 sailors who ate together and shared provisions. Each mess sent a representative to the galley to collect their allocation. The cook ladled boiling salt meat and its greasy broth into wooden tubs, counted out the prescribed number of biscuits per man, and distributed the rations with the mechanical precision of a machine dispensing fuel. Now witness the actual consumption of these provisions, where the sensory reality becomes almost unbearable. The salt meat, even after hours of boiling, remained tough and fibrous, requiring serious jaw strength to chew. The taste was overwhelmingly salty with undertones of rancidity that no amount of cooking could eliminate. The texture was stringy and dry despite the boiling, sucking all moisture from the mouth. Sailors learned to chew each piece thoroughly, working it like cud, because swallowing too quickly could cause choking on the tough fibers. Some pieces contained gristle or bone fragments that had to be carefully worked free and spat out. The ship's biscuit presented its own unique challenges. Even when soaked in the meat's greasy broth, it retained a hardness that could crack teeth. The flavor was bland at best, musty and slightly sour when the flour had been poorly stored. The texture was chalky and dry, absorbing saliva and leaving the mouth feeling coated with paste. And then there were the weevils, small dark specks that crunched between the teeth, adding a bitter, slightly nutty flavor to the otherwise tasteless biscuit. First voyage sailors often gagged and refused to eat once they realized what those dark specks represented. Veterans ate without looking too closely, having learned that hunger eventually overcomes revulsion, and that survival depends on consuming whatever fuel is available. But this daily routine of barely controlled starvation was merely the baseline of naval existence. What happened when even these minimal standards collapsed? How did the ship's rigid hierarchy determine who suffered most when provisions ran short? And what occurred when the very food meant to sustain life became actively poisonous? The answers would reveal the true cost of maintaining an empire through the systematic exploitation of those who served it. Chapter 3. The Hierarchy of Hunger. The ship is not a democracy, and nowhere is this brutal truth more evident than in the distribution of food. While Jack forces down his salt horse and weevil-infested biscuit on the gun deck, an entirely different culinary world exists just a few feet away, separated by thin wooden bulkheads, but divided by an unbridgeable gulf of class and privilege. Here we meet our fourth archetype, the captain, whose absolute authority over the vessel extends to every aspect of life aboard, including who eats well and who slowly starves. The captain's cabin occupies the ship's stern, the most spacious and well-appointed area available. Large windows admit natural light and fresh air. Fine furniture includes a proper dining table, upholstered chairs, and a comfortable cot, rather than a hammock. Most importantly, the captain maintains private stores of provisions, purchased with personal funds or provided through social connections. These stores include items the common sailor never sees: preserved fruits, early tinned meats from emerging canning technology, wine, fresh bread baked by the captain's personal steward, eggs packed in salt, and even live chickens or pigs kept in deck coops to provide fresh meat. The contrast is deliberate and psychologically devastating. Naval hierarchy demanded visible distinctions between ranks, and diet served as one of the clearest markers of status. When the captain dines, he does so on china plates with silver cutlery, drinking wine from crystal glasses, while his steward serves roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the ship's small garden boxes, bread with butter, and preserved fruits for dessert. The quality of his food reflects not just his rank, but his status as a gentleman whose refined palate requires better sustenance than the coarse provisions deemed suitable for common sailors. The ship's officers occupied a middle ground in this hierarchy of hunger. Lieutenants, midshipmen, the surgeon, and other warrant officers messed together in the wardroom, a communal space considerably more comfortable than the crew's quarters, but lacking the captain's privacy and luxury. These officers pooled resources to purchase supplementary provisions beyond standard naval rations. They might buy cheese, better quality biscuits, tea, sugar, and preserved meats from private suppliers before departure. During the voyage, they could also purchase items from the ship's slop chest, a store of goods maintained by the purser at marked-up prices. This system created resentment that simmered constantly beneath the surface of naval discipline. Jack, working on deck in all weather, hauling heavy loads, climbing rigging in storms, and performing backbreaking labor for 14 hours daily, received the worst food available. Meanwhile, officers who performed little physical labor ate significantly better, and the captain, who often spent most of his time in his cabin reviewing charts and writing reports, ate best of all. The injustice was obvious and intentional, but questioning it meant severe punishment. The hierarchy was absolute, and hunger, like everything else aboard ship, reflected one's position in the social order. The most potent tool of control in this system was alcohol, specifically the daily issue of grog. The water, as we have established, was often undrinkable. Beer spoiled quickly in tropical climates. So the Navy relied on rum, but they didn't simply distribute it freely. In 1740, Admiral Vernon had ordered rum diluted with water to prevent drunkenness and maintain discipline, creating the mixture known as grog. The daily grog ration became the high point of the sailor's existence, the only burst of flavor and warmth in a gray world of deprivation. At 11 in the morning or noon, depending on the ship's routine, the fifer would play Nancy Dawson, and the men would line up with their tin cups for their allocation. The mixture, 1 part rum to 4 parts water, often with lemon juice and sugar added when available, provided both calories and mild anesthesia. It numbed the pain of constant labor, dulled the taste of rotten food, and kept the crew in a state of mild compliant sedation that made their circumstances more bearable. The psychology of the grog ration was complex and carefully calculated. It was presented as a right, not a privilege. Yet it could be withdrawn as punishment. Stopping the grog was a devastating penalty that socially isolated the offender from the communal ritual that bound the mess together. Sailors became fiercely protective of their grog, measuring it with eagle eyes to ensure the purser didn't shortchange them. It was literally the only thing on the ship that tasted good, the only reliable escape from the grinding misery of their daily existence. Yet even this rigid hierarchy offered no protection when provisions truly failed. When voyages extended longer than expected due to storms, navigational errors, or mechanical failures, the entire ship faced crisis regardless of rank. The purser would inform the captain that stores were running dangerously low and rations must be reduced. The captain would give the order, and suddenly the already inadequate daily allowance would shrink further. Half rations meant half a pound of salt meat instead of a full pound, fewer biscuits, reduced beer or water. The men would rise from meals still hungry, their bodies burning more calories than they consumed, beginning the slow process of starvation that would continue until they reached port or died. During these periods of short rations, the ship's atmosphere changed dramatically. Hunger sharpened tempers and shortened fuses. Fights broke out over trivial matters as men's self-control eroded along with their physical strength. They became listless and weak, unable to perform duties with their usual efficiency, creating a dangerous spiral where the ship's operation deteriorated just when peak performance was most crucial. The surgeon would note increasing cases of mysterious ailments, swollen gums, loose teeth, old wounds reopening, and general weakness that seemed to spread through the crew like a plague. The communal aspects of eating provided both torture and comfort during these desperate times. The mess groups developed elaborate rituals around their meager rations, trying to make the monotonous provisions more palatable through whatever creativity they could muster. Some sailors became skilled at preparing skilly-gaily, a dish made by crumbling ship's biscuit into boiling water with bits of salt pork fat, creating a kind of porridge. Others made dandy funk, mixing crushed biscuit with molasses and pork fat, then baking it on metal sheets over the galley fires. These concoctions represented no actual improvement in nutrition or flavor. They merely transformed the same terrible ingredients into something that felt different, providing psychological relief from monotony, if not actual sustenance. The most enterprising sailors engaged in what was called fishing, attempting to supplement official rations through any means possible. When ships anchored near land, they would try to catch fish, trap birds, or gather shellfish and seaweed. Some kept lines trailing behind the ship constantly, hoping to catch something edible from the ocean's depths. Others learned which parts of the ship's rats were least diseased and how to prepare them. During tropical voyages, flying fish sometimes landed on deck at night, providing unexpected fresh protein that sailors would cook immediately before officers could claim it for the wardroom. But these supplementary efforts could never address the fundamental problem. The ship's official provisions were systematically inadequate, both in quantity and quality, to maintain human health during extended voyages. The Admiralty knew this. The captains knew this. The sailors certainly knew this. Yet the system persisted because it was cheap, because it was traditional, and because the lives of common sailors were considered expendable in service of naval supremacy and imperial expansion. However, the greatest horror was yet to come. Beyond hunger, beyond monotony, beyond the psychological torture of watching officers feast while the crew starved, lurked a more insidious enemy. The human body requires specific nutrients to function properly, and the complete absence of these nutrients from the sailor's diet would soon transform routine suffering into active biological warfare against the men who served the empire. Chapter 4. The Price of Empire. 3 months into a voyage to the South China Sea, Britannia encounters a crisis that transforms routine hardship into medical catastrophe. The ship's surgeon, making his morning rounds through the crew quarters, notices something that fills him with dread. Several sailors are displaying symptoms he recognizes but cannot treat. Their gums have begun to swell and darken. Their breath carries the sweet, sickly smell of rotting flesh. Old scars are reopening spontaneously, bleeding freely from wounds that had healed years ago. The surgeon knows he is witnessing the early stages of scurvy, the mysterious disease that has killed more sailors than all the naval battles in British history combined. The horror of scurvy defies easy description, representing a complete breakdown of the human body's ability to maintain itself. It begins subtly with fatigue and depression, a crushing lethargy that makes the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. The victim becomes nostalgic and melancholy, obsessed with memories of home and fresh food. Then the physical deterioration begins in earnest. The gums swell until they cover the teeth, turning black and spongy, growing so large that eating becomes agony. The breath develops an unbearable stench of decay. Subcutaneous bleeding creates massive bruises across the body. Bones that had broken and healed years earlier spontaneously refracture as the body's collagen dissolves. Watch Jack as the disease takes hold. He sits on his sea chest, running his tongue over teeth that feel loose in their sockets, tasting blood that flows constantly from his swollen gums. His legs are mottled with dark bruises from internal bleeding, and he can barely stand without fainting. A scar on his hand from a childhood accident has reopened and refuses to heal, weeping constantly despite his efforts to bandage it. He knows he is dying, can feel his body literally falling apart, but he remains fully conscious and aware throughout the process. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of scurvy. It destroys the body while leaving the mind intact to witness every stage of the deterioration. The great tragedy of scurvy in the Victorian era was that its cure had been known for nearly a century. As early as 1747, James Lind had conducted controlled experiments proving that citrus fruits prevented and cured the disease. By the 1790s, the Royal Navy had begun issuing lemon juice rations, and scurvy was virtually eliminated from British ships. But then, in a catastrophic example of bureaucratic penny pinching, the Admiralty made a change that would cost thousands of lives. In the early Victorian period, administrators decided to switch from Mediterranean lemons to West Indian limes because they were grown in British colonies and cost significantly less. This seemed like sound economic policy, supporting imperial trade while reducing expenses. The problem was that limes contained far less vitamin C than lemons, and the industrial processing methods used to bottle the juice, pumping it through copper pipes and exposing it to air and heat, destroyed most of the remaining vitamin content. So Victorian sailors dutifully consumed their daily ration of lime juice, believing it protected them from scurvy, while the disease returned with devastating force. They were drinking a placebo, a bitter, useless liquid that provided no protection while giving them false confidence in their safety. This substitution earned British sailors the nickname limeys, but it also sentenced thousands to agonizing deaths that could have been easily prevented. The systematic nature of this failure reveals the true character of Victorian imperial administration. In comfortable offices in London, bureaucrats made decisions based on ledger books and cost calculations, treating human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of economic efficiency. They viewed sailors as replaceable components in the imperial machine, expendable parts whose suffering was simply the cost of doing business. If a ship arrived in Hong Kong with 10% of its crew dead from scurvy, that was considered normal operational loss, not a preventable tragedy. The provisioning system that created these conditions was not an accident of limited technology. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize profits over human welfare at every level. The contractors who supplied naval provisions had every incentive to cut corners, using the cheapest, oldest ingredients available while billing for higher quality goods. They knew their salt beef might be decades old, their biscuits infested with insects, their preserved vegetables nutritionally worthless. They supplied these provisions anyway because the system rewarded cost reduction over quality, and because the men who would suffer the consequences had no voice in the process. The introduction of canned provisions in the mid-1800s promised to revolutionize naval diet, but early canning technology proved as dangerous as the traditional methods it was meant to replace. Canners used lead solder to seal tins, not understanding that lead would leach into acidic foods and slowly poison consumers. The sterilization process was inconsistent, sometimes failing to kill bacteria and resulting in cans that appeared sound but contained botulism or other deadly toxins. The most notorious example was the Franklin expedition of 1845, which vanished completely in the Arctic after consuming contaminated canned provisions. This disaster cast a long shadow over naval provisioning, making both sailors and officers deeply suspicious of technological solutions. But the physical suffering was only part of the story. The psychological impact of the naval diet system was equally devastating, creating a culture of despair and resignation that permeated every aspect of shipboard life. Men watched their messmates die slowly from diseases they knew were preventable, understanding that their own deaths might follow the same pattern. They saw officers dining on fresh provisions while they consumed decades-old salt meat, creating resentment that simmered constantly beneath the surface of naval discipline. The ship became a floating laboratory for studying the effects of systematic malnutrition on human beings. The surgeon kept careful records of symptoms and deaths, noting the progression of scurvy, the effects of contaminated water, the consequences of vitamin deficiency. These records were filed away in Admiralty archives, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about nutrition and disease that would eventually lead to reforms. But for the men who provided this data with their suffering and deaths, the knowledge came too late. As Jack lies dying in his hammock, his body consumed by scurvy, and his spirit broken by months of systematic deprivation, we must ask ourselves what his sacrifice accomplished. The tea in London drawing rooms, the silk in fashionable shops, the spices in middle-class kitchens, all of these luxuries were transported across the oceans by men like Jack. Men who paid for the empire's wealth with their health, their dignity, and often their lives. The Victorian age's prosperity was built not on the heroism celebrated in popular literature, but on the quiet suffering of those who had no choice but to endure whatever conditions their social superiors deemed acceptable. The naval diet was not simply a matter of limited technology or unavoidable hardship. It was a conscious choice to treat human beings as expendable resources in service of imperial expansion. The knowledge existed to provide adequate nutrition. The technology was available to preserve food safely. The wealth certainly existed to purchase quality provisions. But doing so would have required acknowledging that common sailors' lives had value beyond their labor, and that the empire had moral obligations to those who served it. Instead, the system persisted because it was profitable, because it reinforced social hierarchies, and because those who suffered lacked the power to demand better treatment. The elegant drawing rooms of Victorian England, with their polished silver and fine china, were sustained by the systematic starvation of the men who made global trade possible. The empire's wealth was extracted not just from distant colonies, but from the bodies of its own servants, consumed as surely as coal in a furnace. When we look at paintings of magnificent sailing ships cutting through blue waters, their white canvas full of wind and promise, we must remember what sustained the men who sailed them. Behind the romance of the Age of Sail lies the reality of the weevil-infested biscuit, the decades-old salt beef, the lime juice that provided no protection from the diseases that would dissolve their bodies from within. These men ate not to enjoy, but to endure. They consumed rot and called it dinner, because the alternative was death, and because the empire that sent them to sea valued their labor more than their lives. The question that haunts us across the centuries is whether this suffering was necessary or simply accepted because those who endured it lacked the power to refuse. The Victorian sailor's diet was not an unfortunate consequence of primitive technology. It was a choice, made repeatedly, to prioritize cost over human welfare, tradition over innovation, profit over basic decency. The men who ate that food, who survived despite it or died because of it, deserve to be remembered not as statistics in Admiralty reports, but as human beings who paid the true price of empire with their bodies and their lives. What does this forgotten history tell us about the foundations of the world we inherited? How many of our own comforts rest on similar bargains, similar acceptances of suffering as necessary costs of progress? The next time you see a romantic image of the Age of Sail, remember the taste of salt horse and the crunch of weevils between desperate teeth. Remember that empire was built not on glory, but on the quiet courage of men who swallowed their revulsion along with their rations, because they had no other choice. Share your thoughts on what aspect of this hidden history surprised you most. If you want to continue exploring the human costs behind history's polished facades, the forgotten workers, the invisible suffering, the true price of progress, subscribe and join us as we uncover more uncomfortable truths about the past that shaped our present. The stories that official histories prefer to forget are often the ones we most need to remember.